year student here. So with respect to the graph that we had seen regarding the wealth of individuals versus the employee salaries, we have seen through many reports that the CEO salaries have risen manifold with respect to the average employee salaries. So is there a mechanism to ensure that through these pro-business policies, the wealth that is created actually trickles down to the lower levels, given that now income inequality or wealth inequality is a widely discussed topic?
I think this is an excellent question. You've used the example of the CEO salaries versus that of the average worker's salary. But to get at a broader point, I think one aspect that actually, before I get to answering this question, just suppose those of you who are students here, let's suppose that this is term 3 that is going on, right? Let's do this thought experiment. Suppose I'm the professor, and I tell you that irrespective of how your exam performance is going to be in the the end term, I'm going to give everybody a B. Okay? Everybody gets a B. What would be your response? Would you study then? What will happen? Those students that are actually working very hard towards the A, in particular, their incentives to actually work hard will go down. So the brighter students will be the ones who will actually stop working harder. They'll not learn enough. And the students who actually are anyway, let's say getting a B or a C, those that are not working hard enough to be anticipating a C have to do nothing more. The point of this example is what? If you actually do not have some difference in the outcomes, then your incentives get affected. If everybody is told that everybody gets a B, then in particular the guys who actually are going to be, who are working towards the A, who are the brighter ones, their incentives is what gets dampened. I think this is a very important point that needs to be kept in mind whenever we talk about inequality. Without this particular perspective, I think any debate on inequality is incomplete. Now, we have a problem in this same example. If you basically if I start giving A's, not based on your performance, but maybe what your dad is or your mom is, right? Which is about, because let's say you got, property, you got wealth or whatever, right? Then we have but if I'm giving you an A just because of how good you are as a student, how hard you work, then that is fair. Some amount, in other words, in an economy, some amount of inequality is important for incentives. But too much, obviously, like in anything else, too much is bad. And here's where, of course, welfare is a very important aspect of society. Because, we all basically we come with different factor endowments. Where you're born itself is a factor endowment. So, in order to sort of bring equalization, welfare is important. At the same time, governance is important. In the specific context that you spoke, boards play a very important role. I can tell you from my own personal examples on the boards that I've sat in, this is something that I've actually been very, very conscious about. Those are some of the mechanisms that have to be used to try and bring it to the optimal level. But the optimal level is not zero.
Hello sir, thank you for the wonderful talk. I am Himadri, a doctoral student of economics. So the last economic survey you talked about the nudge theory to drive social and economic change in the country. My question is, how do you contextualize the nudge theory in the context of wealth creation in India, especially from an individual's perspective more than an institution's perspective?
Again, a very, very good question. So let me give you the insider's insight on the motivation for behavioral economics. So there's a story to this. You know, my wife, who now manages all the MBA programs at ISB, was also an MBA student at Chicago Booth when I was doing my PhD. And she happened to take the class on behavioral economics that Professor Richard Taylor taught. She was the one who first took it and then actually asked me to take the class. And so I took the class and then also took a PhD class on behavioral economics because I liked it. But the reason I'm bringing this up is because at that time when I actually learned behavioral economics, what struck me is the role of social norms, the role of culture in affecting behavior. And what particularly struck me was the applicability to the Indian context, because we are a very, very old civilization, very old society. As a result, our norms of behavior, they're very, very grounded, or it can be taken in a positive or a negative sense. But what behavioral economics does is it basically teaches you two things. One, that a lot of our behavior is driven by norms, social norms, but small changes, small nudges to that can also help in enabling better behavior. For instance, the example, when I created the videos explaining behavioral economics, I used this, I'm sure all of you have felt this. You keep an alarm to get up in the morning to go for a jog. You keep the alarm for 6:30, but when the alarm rings, you put it down and actually maybe get irritated at that alarm and then go to sleep. But if you get a short, small nudge, which is maybe your dad or your mom or some friend, incessantly calls you up at 6:30, then inevitably you will get up and you'll go for, that's a small nudge. It's in that context that actually I see the broader narrative across the two surveys. That, for instance, there we talked about one of the key ideas there was the use of our own, our spiritual and religious norms to enable gender equality, to enable, inclusion, and going and, really tapping into something that is our strength, which is our old civilization. So in that sense, this is a reflection of the same idea, where now wealth creation itself as an important pursuit, as a noble pursuit, dharma, arth, kama, moksha, is also actually it's been talked about. I think I have, having had the good fortune of being in the United States for 10 years, visiting several parts of the world, and then coming back to India, I've been able to see India for both its good and its bad, rather than just getting, enamored by everything that other countries have to give us. And there are some very important things that they have, but not just being blindly, saying, oh, everything that other countries have to give is great. No, there is enough, things here, and that I say this with the credibility of someone who basically went to one of the best engineering colleges in this country, and therefore they expected to have the necessary scientific temper. So I say this with the scientific temper, and having seen the world, that there is a lot that India has to offer, and that is what I actually, it's my endeavor to try and bring that to all of us.
Good evening, sir. Myself, Samir Vishwas, second year doctoral student from Operation Management Group. My question is related to your slides relating to the opening of the sector. And in your slides, you say that the railways is a closed sector as per your economic survey. And now the Ministry of Railways recently allows the private parties to start the private trains or the corporate trains. However, as you know, the railways exploited its capacity without increasing the pie. How government allows the private sector to cannibalize its own business? Because the fare increases in the corporates, and how the government allows without increasing their own fare, the corporate fares to be increased while the profit goes to the other party.
You know, let me be honest here. It is questions like these that motivate me to write about wealth creation. But I'll respond to the question. The point that is being made here is that if you look at efficiencies on average are far greater in the private sector than in the public sector. And I don't think I have a chart here, but you know, I would ask you to go and check the, this is I think the chapter 8 or 9 on privatization. There's a particular chart, it's the first chart in the chapter, it's called privatization and wealth creation. What is so telling is look at the stock prices of Bharat Petroleum and Hindustan Petroleum, BPCL and HPCL, after the announcement of privatization. You know, if I could pull that chart here, I think that I would be able to. Does this computer have internet in it? Does it have? No. Anyway, leave it. But I would ask all of you, all of you and others who might have similar questions to actually go and check this chart. So, up until the announcement of privatization of Bharat Petroleum, BPCL and HPCL, we can show that? Okay. So can you guys see this chart? This shows so that blue line is that of BPCL stock price and the red line is HPCL stock price. And that line that is being put is when the announcement of privatization of BPCL happened. What is so interesting is up until that announcement, BPCL and HPCL are snaking together. And then, on announcement, BPCL stock price just takes off. And this difference here, you know what is the amount? This is 33,000 crores. 33,000 crores. Now, observe, by the way, this is actually a tip for you for PhD work as well, apples to apples comparison. Taking BPCL and HPCL, this difference here is 33,000 crores, which has to be attributed to the decision to privatize BPCL. So there's an increase in national wealth. Why? Because both public sector and private sector are part of the national wealth. But even if you want to focus only on the wealth of the government, because government will be selling this, there is an increase of 33,000 crores. And I'm sure you would have taken classes in finance, where you would have learned that the stock price is the present value of future expected cash flows. And those expected cash flows are from the efficiency gains. So this talk about cannibalization, private sector doing X, Y, Z, I think needs to be seen in this context. If anything, I would take the move that has been announced to actually reflecting the idea that giving more space to the private sector enables efficiencies. And one more this is something which a lot of people make this mistake. Again, I'm going to use what I learned, in statistics here, which is mixing up two statistical measures. Oftentimes, what we do is we mix up outliers and averages. If you want to compare public sector versus private sector, you cannot take an outlier, either positive side or negative side from any one of those groups. You have to compare averages to averages. Or if you want to compare outliers or a particular point in the distribution, pick up the worst, in public sector and the worst in private sector, compare that. Or pick up the best in the public sector and the best in the private sector, compare that. Bad logic is to take some outlier in the private sector and compare it with the average in the public sector, because you're mixing up apples and oranges. When you do a proper statistical comparison, it is very, very clear that both in terms of averages, which is to take the mean, to take the median, or you do it in a distributional sense, the concept of what is called first order stochastic dominance. I'm sure you would have learned this in statistics. If you do it, talk in a distributional sense as well, the evidence is amply clear that efficiencies are far more in the private sector than in the public sector.
Hello sir, my name is Srikar. I'm a second year student at MBA program. So my question is actually a mixture of those two questions asked before. So my point was, you were talking about the wealth creation. The question is about how the wealth creation is being done presently also. Like the new Indian entrepreneurs, consider I'm actually having a plan of starting a company like 2-3 years down the line. But the present financial instruments present are like you have to take a funding from a PE, VC firm or a big bank outside the world, out of the country comes and funds you if your ideas are good and all. So my point is, now this is actually playing into the hands of income inequality going ahead, because if the company succeeds, mostly the foreign funds are growing actually, the influence of them is growing, you are actually playing into the same circle itself, right? So my question is, what different the Indian entrepreneurs should do so that they do wealth creation also, and also it decreases income inequality in a way.
So actually, I find your question to be unclear because it is mixing up a bunch of things. Firstly, as an entrepreneur, you want capital. I would say that you would be agnostic, money doesn't have any color. Does it have? So, I don't quite understand what we're talking about is wealth creation. Creating a company, as you are talking about, requires capital. If that capital is, if the world economy is flush with capital and is available cheap, why not enable it to actually fund asset creation in the Indian economy? If that helps, why not? It's like, think about it. Suppose I want to, start a company and my neighbor is willing to fund it. Why not take it?
Valid enough. So the focus was more about like the top 10%. Actually, the wealth of the top 10% in the world has increased from 60% to 70% and all. So now the rules of the game are fixed, right? So the top 10% actually fund the people. And
look, I think this is so. I have respect for Thomas Piketty's work, and I actually have read that work. But it's really important that we basically do not end up, missing the wood for the trees. I think I responded earlier to a question. This is, I think, a very important aspect that we need to remember. Always, I think this is something that IIM Calcutta teaches you very well, which is think using distributions. Differentiate between averages and outliers. Yes, there is, that undeniably there is some inequality. But let that not basically make us throw the baby with the bathtub, which is to actually, the evidence that I showed you clearly, anecdotally I'll talk about, for instance, when I was very young, there were many people who actually in my community who, in where I used to live, we used to call them bhaiyas, actually people who would go to the employment exchange and would basically not, come back, didn't have that much job. These are people who had studied MCom, MA, and so on. And after liberalization, now I have many cousins of mine who actually only have done, sometimes just finished class 12, and they're able to work with a BPO company or. So indeed, opening up the economy clearly has had, has had impact, and that's the other important point I want to mention actually. Again, here you must have learned, all of you would have learned the Bayes theorem. Scientific thinking is about using the Bayes theorem, which is, what is the Bayes theorem about? There's a prior and there's a posterior. And, when the evidence comes, the posterior changes compared to the prior. Biased thinking is when even after you have presented the evidence, you continue to stick to your prior. Scientific thinking is using the Bayes theorem. When you presented evidence like the ones that I have provided and many others, that you change from your prior to your posterior. The prior is what oftentimes manifests as our biases. So let's be scientific in our thinking, and which means use Bayes theorem to update our beliefs.
Thank you for the lecture. So I'm Pratima, a second year MBA student. My question is basically when you talked about wealth creation without causing any harm. So you mentioned climate change over there. But we've seen that countries and economies have grown over time, like they've created wealth, and now they're focusing on the environment and climate change issues. So why, is there any way we can inculcate this from now on, or what exactly would have been the case if they would have considered the environment and the climate back there?
So of course, what might have happened in the past is a matter of speculation. It's basically thinking about the counterfactual, which, I can speculate one scenario, you could speculate another. I think that may not be very useful, but going forward, I think, at least from the Indian context, the Honorable Prime Minister has actually mentioned many times about climate change. In fact, is leading, negotiations on climate change. For instance, our emphasis on electric vehicles, our emphasis a lot more on use of solar energy. So, and this is again consistent with our ancient wisdom, which is about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. The entire world is my family. That is how we've always thought about. Our policies reflect that particular idea, that we want to actually grow by creating minimum damage. But at the same time, we also have to be cognizant of our duty to our citizens to basically enable their prosperity.
Mr. Director, to please felicitate our chief guest. respected director, chief guest, faculty colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen, I on behalf of IIM Calcutta extend a very heartfelt vote of thanks to Dr. Krishnamurthy V. Subramanian, Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, for his illuminating talk on paradigm shift in the contemporary economic thinking in regards to wealth creation, as given in the latest economic survey. It's quite interesting to know that the new thinking is that the reason why India was the dominant economic power for 3/4 of the recorded economic history was actually by design, and that is being ethical wealth creation, wherein it's facilitated both by market and trust. It's indeed a proud moment for IIM Calcutta to welcome back and hear one of our prominent alumni who has made a mark in both academia and government. Thank you very much, sir. I'd also like to thank the family of late Professor Abhijit Mukherjee for their endowment to IIM Calcutta, which makes this lecture possible. I'd also like to thank our officers and staff for their splendid logistics support. Please join us for refreshments which are being served at the outside auditorium. Thank you very much.